Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and good morning, I should say as well, for those of you in other time zones. We appreciate you joining us today for the first of what will be 4 over the next 2 days of our Gale Days. And today we have a great topic for you, influencing meaningful change for social justice issues. And we have some great speakers for you today as well. I'm Roger Strong. I'm Vice President of Academic Sales at Gale. And before we get started, a couple housekeeping issues. So we will be recording today's session. So we will be sharing the link out with all of those that did register for the session. The other thing is we do have the chat function turned off. We will be chatting out relevant information to you all, but we ask that you include questions that you have for our panelists today in the Q&A, and we will plan to answer those at the end of the session. And outside of that, we'll also touch on at the end some of our other Gale Days events coming up this afternoon and also tomorrow. So with that, I did want to introduce our panelists. Today we have with us Shawn Smith-Cruz, Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning and Engagement at NYU. And Shawn is co-coordinating volunteer archivist at the Lesbian Her Story Archives and co-chair for the Board of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies at the Graduate Center, CUNY, and chair of the CLAGS Archives Committee. Shawn has a BS in Queer Women's Studies from the CUNY Bachelor Program and MFA in Creative Writing Fiction, and an MLS with a focus on archiving and records management from Queens College. She is an assistant curator and associate dean for teaching, learning, and engagement at NYU Division of Libraries. And she was recently selected for the Women and Gender Studies Section Award for significant achievement in Women and Gender Studies librarianship. Also with us today, we have Professor Kristen Duncan. Kristen is an assistant professor of social studies education at Clemson University. Her research focuses on the ways Black teachers approach issues of race and racism in their classroom, and the ways African and the diaspora are represented in social studies curricular materials and at historic sites. Her research has been published in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, Educational Studies, and Social Education. As a teacher educator, she works to help preserve and in-service teachers develop a critical lens that they can apply to issues of race, gender, sexuality, class, and other aspects of education. And finally, we have Phil Virta from Gale, who is an acquisitions editor. He's been with Gale for more than 15 years in various capacities, and most recently as a publisher of our digital primary source archives in charge of the Archives of Sexuality and Gender program. So welcome to all of you. And at this point, I will kick it over to Professor Kristen Duncan for her to talk with you a little bit about the research that she's been doing. Kristen?
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I am going to share my screen with you all. As Roger just told you, my name is Kristen Duncan, and I'm a professor, an assistant professor at Clemson University. And today I'm going to talk to you about the work that a lot of us in teacher education are doing to develop social justice oriented teachers. So before I get started, as you just heard, I study Black teachers, and a lot of people wonder why it is that I study Black teachers. So I study the way Black teachers talk about race because most of the research is about white teachers discussing race. And a significant portion of that is about white teachers struggling to discuss race. I think there's a lot to be learned from the ways Black teachers approach this issue, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about that. So first, what do we know about teachers and students? So in the United States, 79.3% of public school teachers are white. That's actually down a little bit. It was 82% for quite a while. So yeah, the vast majority of public school teachers are white, but the majority of public school students are students of color. So 55%, that's most students are students of color, and schools are becoming increasingly diverse, right? Additionally, K-12 schools are actually more segregated in the year 2020. So right now, schools are more segregated than they were in 1954 when the Brown v. Board decision was handed down. Why does that matter? That means most of the white teachers that are teaching students of color and white students only went to school with white students and had white teachers, right? So it is very possible that pre-service teachers have made it, we call students who are in school to become teachers, pre-service teachers. So it's very likely that pre-service teachers have gone the first 2 decades of their lives without having meaningful relationships with people of color. And as a result of this, many teachers report feeling uncomfortable discussing race with their students. So, what can we learn from Black teachers? There's a whole lot that we can learn from Black teachers. So, one of the things that I have found in my research really deals with this quote. So, this is a quote from Bettina Love, who is a professor at the University of Georgia. And she said that white supremacy isn't the shark, it's the water. Black teachers are really realistic and upfront with Black students about the existence of racism, the likelihood, their students' likelihoods of encountering racism, right? Think about what's been widely known in the media now as the talk that Black parents have with their kids about interacting with the police. Black teachers are also this pragmatic about racism with their students. So we like to often think that kids are young and we want to protect their innocence, but realistically, that can be detrimental to Black students if they don't know what they're going to run up against. So Black teachers are really realistic about the ubiquitous nature of racism, right? That they're going to encounter it at multiple points in their lives, that structural and systemic racism shaped a number of important aspects of their lives, and they help them understand the role that racism plays in their lives. Another thing that Black teachers do when discussing racism with Black students is they help to develop their students' voices. So Bell Hooks talks about talking back to your oppression. Black teachers actually create platforms or encourage students to use previously existing platforms to talk back to their oppression. And I can give you an example of this. So I'll give you 2 examples. So there was one teacher I studied who created platforms for her students. They were having all these encounters either with other teachers or with agents of the state. And she kind of created a space in her classroom for them to just be able to talk it out, to get it out somewhere. And then their classmates could help them walk through that issue together. Another teacher actually, this is a really interesting story. So he was the only Black teacher in his grade level at the school where he taught, but nearly all the students were either Black or Latino or Latinx, I'm sorry. And one student in his class, this is a math teacher, keep in mind, she wanted to study the Black Lives Matter movement for her social studies fair project. But her social studies teacher, who was a white woman, told her that it was too controversial and that she might offend some people. Now, keep in mind, this was a few years ago before Black Lives Matter had the acceptance that it has today in 2020. So the math teacher took it upon himself to supervise the student's project because she really wanted to do this. She wanted to learn more about it, but she also wanted to teach her classmates, her teachers, the people coming to the fair about the Black Lives Matter movement. But her teacher, her social studies teacher, didn't support that. So he encouraged her to use a platform that existed to get that knowledge out. Shifting in context. So one thing that Black teachers do skillfully, I would argue that they do this masterfully, is change the ways in which they discuss race based on the teaching context they find themselves in. So the standards and accountability movement of the last 2 decades has really heightened surveillance in school classrooms. And while this may seem outlandish or unlikely, there are school districts where the superintendent might walk through your door at any given moment just to see what you're doing. And this is far more likely for teachers who teach a subject like math or reading, something that is valued in the testing stratosphere. So the teachers were able to move how they discuss things with how they were being surveilled ultimately. So if if I'm being expected to teach the unit circle or y equals mx plus b, then I might not be as explicit about my discussions of race. Some math teachers did do a really good job of incorporating it into a data unit or like with word problems, but I might have those conversations in the hallway, or some students might choose to stay back and eat lunch in my classroom and have those discussions. Whereas social studies teachers, the nature of the content allows a little more wiggle room, but even with teachers who teach like world history, that can be a challenge. Like how, if someone walks in my room and they're expecting me to be discussing the government of Saudi Arabia, how can I manage to discuss this thing that I think is really pivotal? So when the events were happening in Ferguson following the death of Michael Brown, some social studies teachers, and I think this is so genius, were able to tie. So there were, if you recall, there were quite a few protests in Ferguson following the death of Michael Brown. So these teachers, instead of sticking solely to the state standards, they were able to tie the rights and freedoms of citizens in Saudi Arabia to the rights and freedoms of citizens in the United States, one of which, as you know, is the freedom to assembly or the right to protest. So they kind of use that as an inroads to discuss the death of Michael Brown at the hands of police and the protest that followed. That to me is a stunning level of genius, right? They understand the context that they're in, and so they shift to do this work because they think it's that important. And finally, Black teachers learn to teach in these ways from various life experiences. The perhaps jarring part is that teacher education isn't even mentioned remotely when you ask Black teachers where they learned to do this work. So the question then becomes, what can teacher educators learn from this, and how can we help our pre-service teachers develop these social justice oriented lenses? So we as a teacher educator, I do not expect a white 20-year-old to do what I just told you that Black teachers are doing, because these teachers have been Black for their whole lives, and they developed a certain critical lens regarding race from their lived experience. But there are lessons that we can learn moving forward. So the first is to help our students develop a critical lens. Because if you think everything is fine, then you're not going to see the problems that exist. You have to have you can't take a critical lens to race if you don't have a critical lens. So the first thing we do is help our students develop a critical lens. And in my courses, so I'm a social studies teacher educator. I prepare history, geography, civics teachers. So we take a critical lens to everything, right? We take it to historical narratives. Well, why did you learn this story of Rosa Parks instead of what actually happened, right? Like, why is the narrative that is traditionally pushed that she was tired and did not want to get up from her seat? Why didn't you learn that Rosa Parks was actually a civil rights activist long before she refused to leave her seat that day? We critique maps, right? So even maps are authored texts. Why do we use maps that make Africa look smaller than it really is and center Europe? So it's really kind of like an unraveling of everything you thought you knew. And once pre-service teachers learn to question those things, then they can become critical about race. So also lots of teacher educators are having pre-service teachers do that inward work, right? And examine what role race has played in their lives. How might they be privileged? So once we can unlock that, then we can also explore other identity issues, right? Like, how are we serving our linguistically diverse students? How are we incorporating LGBTQ historical figures in our curriculum? So ultimately, though, teacher education programs need to reform, and some really progressive universities are already doing this. So Bree Pickauer says, opportunities for both self-reflection and instruction about historical oppression and current educational inequity should be provided throughout the entire teacher education experience. So we want to make sure that the things that I just told you about aren't happening in just one class, that they're happening all over teacher education programs. This needs to be a thorough undertaking that is integrated throughout the program. And that is it for me. And next up, we have Shawn Smith-Cruz.
Thanks, Kristen. So thanks everyone for having me. Sorry, I'm just queuing up my little document here. Here we go. So this landing slide has a picture of a black box theater. And I use this image because it holds a memory for me of a collectively run space in New York City, the Wild Cafe Theater, back in my nostalgic 20s, when for over 10 years, I hosted a cabaret show for queer women of color called Rivers of Honey. And in this particular show, I brought materials from the Lesbian History Archives from an exhibit called Keepin' On, Black Lesbians. And I just added it to the wall. And this traveling exhibit is of images of Black lesbian pioneers, iconic writers, librarians, artists, and activists, and community members. And in this space, it lined the walls so that as I performed in the center, I was able to tell a story of a ceremoniously laid rice bed, recited and relived that the fact was my Garifuna grandmother's altar was her stove. And during intermission, attendees scanned the walls, connecting image to ancestor, desire to movement, authorship to creativity, and ultimately engaging us both as witness and participant in a fully established transformative space of community. So in my description of Wild Cafe Theater and the Rivers of Honey space, I really feel like the intention was to bring the archive to performance, librarianship to community, scholarship to action, learning to pleasure, or maybe pleasure to learning, teaching to movement work, and with that, transformation, which is my definition of social change as an activation of new possibilities. And I feel like that could occur in that space. So what does it mean and what does it reveal? What is revealed if we apply that in reverse? What manifests when we bring performance, community, and action to our scholarship, libraries and archives, to our teaching and learning? Because I know I'm not the only one who endeavors outside of the box of our traditional frame or adds some enriching good, some salt, some rice, some sugar, some ancestral connection to enter into a new space altogether. What resources do we bring into a space, into our work to manifest the transformation? It's with that question in mind and the sharing of theater that I want us to consider a critical lens, similar to what Kristen just mentioned, to our library staffing and professional developments and our instruction and engagement work. But I want to take it further from resources to natural resources, right? Like, how do we bring natural resources to transform our library work or our education work? I ask about natural resources because some objects we know what to do with. These items are a part of us. Most often, we are equipped to make change, and yet the resources must still be cultivated. And as a colleague reminded me recently, also labor must be attributed and named. So in this image, I bring Kara Walker's A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino's sugar refining plant, hereby referred to as a subtlety. And I think it invokes more than a formative palate at a constituent dinner party, although I like to imagine that everyone sitting in this room had really bitter tea. What do we have in our collective arsenals as librarians and educators that can activate our work and collide positionalities and standpoints at the scale of a subtlety? This can be seen as an integration of the body into a space, your role, your work, and your contribution, or it can be even more literal as a consideration of how a patron and a librarian may interact, or can be broad and brought to spatial concepts. I would argue that critical librarianship does this. Critical librarianship is our subtlety. It allows for the kind of transformation that acknowledges social, economic, and political contexts. It articulates infrastructure, surfaces hidden labor, and I'm using a colleague, Emily Drabinski's talk a couple years ago, where she also quotes Everett Hughes, that it understands that it could have been otherwise. But in order to really fully understand critical librarianship, of course, we have to backtrack a bit and think about intersectionality. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a professor of law at Columbia University, and also the director of the Columbia Law School Center for Intersectionality and Policy Studies, she coined the term intersectionality from her publication of Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex in 1989. And the current definition of intersectionality is that it is a lens through which we can locate the intersecting social divisions of class, race, gender, sexuality, ability, ethnicity, and citizenship to better understand how power operates in a society and creates social inequality. It really is a tool, or I would even argue a natural resource for us to use to define and locate our user groups, locate how we can place ourselves into our work and do so critically. And so because intersectionality stems from critical race theory, We pull from the critical race theory 5 tenets: a critique of liberalism, revisionist history as it relates to American history, some essentialist philosophies, storytelling, counter-storytelling, and narrative, which is why I think archival and primary source materials come directly into that conversation, as well as intersectionality. And critical race theory brings us things like tribal critical race theory, or CRIP theory, or crit-lib, or critical librarianship. So then the question begs to ask, how do libraries integrate critical race theory or other forms of intersectional and anti-racist practice into our work? Moves toward critical librarianship by engaging anti-racism, I would say currently I'm noticing is taking shape across libraries across the states and internationally through our diversity initiatives, right, across various institutions. Also our newly adopted commitments to anti-racism and our anti-racist statements that went to every public website. I also say it comes from our staffing practices and our new staffing practices. I think that Roger's gonna put some links in the chat so that you can have these for yourself to spread around. Diversity initiatives often engage with human resource offices, or often, you know, the diversity initiatives might be led by the human resources offices to steer a more diverse workforce. So solely having Black and brown people in the room is not enough, although it is important to ensure that the positions we're asking for have a critical lens to the work. Harvard has recently posted an associate university librarian for anti-racism, for example. Cornell has added an inclusivity initiatives lens to a new law librarian. Pratt University Libraries, where I actually also teach at their School of Information, has a diversity, equity, and inclusion librarian, and has recently posted for their graduate assistants to take on a new role as #BlackLivesMatter graduate assistants. I'm sitting on their implementation committee for strategic planning as it relates to DEI, and then other institutions who are responding to things like maybe budget cuts and hiring freezes are asking for contingent labor, such as consultants like the Alliance on Digital Humanities, who are seeking a consultant on structural racism. So in creating these opportunities, I think it's important for us to consider what language is useful to add to these position postings to highlight the exact needs and intentions of the work. I think it's important that it aligns with a commitment to inclusion, diversity, belonging, and equity, yes, but that the role is centering on pedagogical approaches in queer, transnational, intersectional, decolonizing, and critical race theory frameworks. We have to consider how the work cannot be centralized to this single position, but instead its focus is structural change throughout the library or the institution, and that the work is focused on an ethic of reparative justice, which implies that we have some repairing to do. There's some changes that have to happen. And with that change, there may be discomfort, but it's necessary. And in fact, any place where we may be comfortable may be the place to start. So really thinking about the language that we use is one way to move forward with that. But we cannot allow for the language to lose its power. We have to use it as its natural resource and add it as a core function of the process. It is the role for everyone to perform diversity work. It's everyone's labor that allows for transformative praxis in librarianship. And some tools that I want to ensure folks walk away with are opportunities for continued learning. So one example of what that could look like is case studies in critical pedagogies, which I'm actually just soliciting right now. So put that link in the chat. And maybe I didn't add the link. I'll add it to it later. Where on Monday, we'll have a forum where an introduction to critical pedagogy will be delivered by Eamon Toole. And I think that that's an important portion because most people think that this is something that they don't have the skills for and cannot implement on their own. And often think they require some additional training as opposed to leading into the natural resources that they already walk with. So let's dispel that and start from the ground up. So we're going to have Eben Toole give an intro. We're going to have 3 different librarians, Julie Jones from Cornish College of the Arts, Iris Finkel from Hunter College, Debbie Kramer from Colgate University. And this is one of a series that is, because we're online, open to everyone to join. And part of what excites me about this day is that after just 2 days of posting, we already have over 300 RSVPs, because I think there is a real thirst for this kind of work. The thirst for critical librarianship, I would argue, is akin to the thirst for a more just society. Students want to see a real acknowledgement, articulation, surfacing, and understanding of structural imbalances of power. They want to see us doing that work. They want us to be accountable. They want a subtlety. The marvelous sugar baby will look different at your institution than it will at others. It can be as bold or as simple. Oops, I didn't mean to click that. But now that I have the link for later. It will be as simple as bold or as simple as adding a background image to the homepage of a website and keeping it there, right? For some undetermined period of time, not just for like 1 week when everyone sort of put their tiles black. But it also means that at the start of every instruction session, acknowledging that the banner is there, right? And adding it to the context of your resource sharing instead of just turning it into a moot image. Instead, it's an opportunity to engage in conversation. There is a real impacting knowledge that our students and constituents are asking for. And I'll end with a case study of my own that just happened last week at NYU Division of Libraries. We had an opportunity to work with the Office of the Provost to hold a collaborative conversation, a difficult conversation on race and racism. And we decided that it should be something that was focused on the election. Working with administrators and librarians across varying departments allowed for a newly imagined program. And the initial flyer, which had like a vector image of a fist in purple, got something like 20 RSVPs after a blast of 13,000 students opened the email. So once we changed the flyer instead to reveal the words justice and to have an actual body holding these words, and with the political climate, we received, again, over 300 RSVPs. And on the day of the event, we had breakout rooms of facilitators who were a part of the various diversity initiative teams across NYU, as well as librarians and people within the libraries. We began with a grounding call. And the grounding, this is just names of people to say collaboration is key. And we began with a grounding call from a library HR specialist whose work is focused on IDBE. The grounding was followed by prompts of narrative. So this can be seen as examples of archival information, examples of critical implications in our work by asking for storytelling and narrative. And the use of voices from scholars of color were chosen because of their responsiveness to impossible truths or violence that they've experienced in their own worlds and how it plays out in the documentation of their contributions to society. I wanted to make sure to add Shirley Chisholm because we're going to hear from Philip Virta next. And of course, we end with an altar. Philip, I'm sending it over to you.
Right. There we go. Thank you so much, Shawn. Thank you, Kristen. Let's see. No, cannot start video because the host just stopped it. Okay, well, maybe the host will start my video so I can actually present here. There we go. All right, now we're going to move on. Let's see if I can get this all set up, share my screen. Going to minimize things out so I can actually see what I'm doing here. All right, now hopefully everybody can see what I'm up to. Perfect. All right, good day, buenos dias, guten tag, everyone. My name is Phil Virta, and once again, thank you to Shawn and Kristen both for those excellent talks. A lot of really good information going. I am the editor in charge of Archives of Sexuality and Gender, and I work on a number of other archives here at Gale. Today, I'm going to talk to you about social justice in the archives. And you can see some of the descriptions here. There are many ways to define social justice, and some of the descriptions come from United Nations, National Association of Social Workers, and the Center for Economic and Social Justice. But in its simplest definition, social justice is about equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal treatment. Social justice issues are really a constant topic in today's society, and of course, they played a major role in the latest US presidential election. So let's move on here. All right, in the context of social justice, let's consider 5 primary source archival collections that really allow us to examine the subject from a variety of perspectives. I'm going to briefly review Gayles Archives of Sexuality and Gender, our Women's Studies Archives, Political Extremism and Radicalism in the 20th Century, 2 collections from the American Civil Liberties Union, and Public Health in Modern America. Each of these collections really helps us explore equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal treatment. And then if we still have a little bit of time, checking my time, I'll give you a little bit of a research aspect to this that Shawn has already alluded to, so let's have some fun. So starting off with Gayles Archives of Sexuality and Gender and Women's Studies Archives, I may refer to them in acronym form as ASG and WSA, so simply so I don't have to say such a mouthful. If you're not familiar with the programs, here's a recap. ASG offers more than 4.5 million pages of material from 82 distinct archival collections across 4 archives. 2 of the archives represent LGBTQ history and culture in the 20th century. 1 presents books covering subjects in sex and sexuality from the 16th to the 20th centuries. And 1 focuses on 20th century LGBTQ activism culture in Southern Africa and Australia, as well as lesbian organizations and culture around the world. The Women's Studies Archives consist of 2 archives, Issues and Identities and Voice and Vision. And together they provide 30 collections and nearly 2 million pages of content from a wide variety of institutional partners. And just to give a shout out to Shepard Ferry, who does the We the People posters, and I love them. Political extremism and radicalism in the 20th century. This is far right and left political groups in the US, Europe, and Australia. The archive documents extreme political groups with a strong focus on fascist and white supremacist movements, but it also includes a range of fringe movements considered radical by contemporaries, such as anti-Catholicism, anti-war, civil rights, communists and socialists, creationists, environmentalists, hate groups, gay and gender rights groups, Holocaust deniers, New Left, and survivalist groups. It's made up of 4 collections and more than 600,000 pages. And the second archive is coming out in a few months called The Far Right in America. Ought to be very interesting. And then the Making of Modern Law series, we have the American Civil Liberties Union papers, 1912 to 1990, and papers from the Southern Regional Office. These 2 collections constitute more than 2.7 million pages of materials covering the actions of the ACLU. And finally, of course, we've got Public Health in Modern America, and public health has a lot to do with social justice. The archive documents the rise of the 20th century public health system in the United States through correspondence, reports, pamphlets, ephemera. It also covers the evolution of US public health policies, initiatives, and campaigns at local, national, and federal levels, as well as highlighting the efforts of key political figures, government agencies, and public health advocates. It really looks at the collections from New York Academy of Medicine and the National Archives Records Administration and spans 553,000 pages of material. Now, each of these archives provides coverage of social justice issues, and the ability to search across all of the archives simultaneously means you have a really powerful resource for drawing research threads together to, if you will, weave a comprehensive tapestry of social justice research. Among many interesting topical areas, you're going to find criminal justice, civil rights, marriage equality, social reform, voting rights, access to health care, abortion and birth control, race relations, and everything else you see here and more. This diversity of perspectives provides ample opportunities for social justice research. For example, you might want to investigate how conscientious objectors were perceived, treated, and protected. You might want to look at changing gender roles and how they influenced women's political activism. How did the Latina and Chicana movements deal with sexism in their own communities and racism within the women's rights movements? What were some of the battles over marijuana and other drugs, and what impact did they have on politics and the criminal justice system? All right, and so quickly, let's use this wealth of material to perform some research into social justice issues. I'm going to travel back to 1972, another presidential election year. Richard Nixon was running for re-election to the White House. Atari's Pong became the first commercially successful video game. Maxi dresses, miniskirts, knee socks, and bold patterns were among the fashion trends. The Vietnam War was ongoing. The June 17th, 1972 break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters would eventually lead to the Watergate scandal. Apollo 17 was a last man mission to the moon. And The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face by Roberta Flack was the #1 song in the country. So thinking of political firsts and in consideration of Kamala Harris becoming the first biracial woman vice president, let's talk about another political first, namely Shirley Chisholm. She was a true social justice crusader. In 1968, Chisholm became the first African-American woman elected to the United States Congress. In 1972, she became the first African-American woman to ever seek a major political party's nomination for the US presidency. This demonstrated that aspirations for the nation's executive office need not be the exclusive domain of white males. She said she ran because someone had to do it first. In this country, everybody is supposed to be able to run for president, but that's never been really true. She said, I ran because most people think the country is not ready for a black candidate and not ready for a woman candidate. So Shirley Chisholm's career in Congress was focused on social justice issues. And there's a wealth of material throughout the archives on her work in this area, but here are some examples. Let's look at her progressive agenda during her 1972 bid for presidency. You can see non-political justice department, appointment of more blacks, non-whites, and women as judges to the FBI and the police forces, civilian review boards against police corruption, minimize discretionary powers of police. Does a lot of this sound familiar? And then she was actually one of the only candidates to speak issues for gay people as far as a straight person. She was a candidate to speak up for gay people. She voted against military appropriations for Vietnam. She was the first to speak up for legalization of marijuana and the first candidate to allow women the right of their own bodies concerning abortion. So admittedly, it's a little disheartening to see that many of the same issues her campaign gave voice to in '72 are still issues today. Political Extremism and Radicalism archive shows us that Chisholm was supported by quite a number of different groups. In this case, she was an advocate for social justice on nearly all fronts. She was recognized by the Gay Activist Alliance as a particularly strong supporter of homosexual rights. Also from political extremism and radicalism, we can see evidence of her support for Black women's political empowerment. She was a founding member of Congressional Black Caucus and National Women's Political Caucus. She was a powerful and outspoken advocate for social justice, especially for women's and women's rights. She stated of women's rights opponents, they suggest that the women's rights efforts drain energies away from more serious issues such as racial discrimination, and they fail to make the connection in their minds that they are part of the same thing, that all discrimination is anti-human. From ACLU, here's a memo from Shirley Chisholm to John Pemberton Jr., who was the executive director of the ACLU, concerning an organized crime bill that was making its way through legislation. One of the provisions under consideration to which she was opposed was preventive detention, and that's the detention of a convicted criminal who has served their sentence but is considered too dangerous to release, or detaining someone without trial or conviction to prevent them from committing an offense in the near future. Chisholm wrote, I believe that the preventive detention measure is a product of fear, wholly out of keeping with basic constitutional rights. In the Public Health Archives, you'll find some social justice issues that Shirley Chisholm supported. In this case, she was on the board of directors of the National Organization of Women. She was a staunch supporter of women's rights to choose what happens with their own body. And of course, many saw Chisholm as a threat to their way of life and ideology. This is from the Hallweg collection in Political Extremism and Radicalism. And we can see how the American Nazi Party, they were still around, was keeping tabs on the government, its representatives, and who they were representing, including a young Chisholm, who was making her first foray into Congress. And not to be outdone, the Christian Nationalist Crusade was keeping tabs on anyone who opposed their own ideological viewpoints. So finally, criticizing what she called a media-driven image or mold that often predetermines candidates for public office, Chisholm suggested, could it be that the persistence of poverty, hunger, racism, war, semi-literacy, and unemployment is partly due to the fact that we have excluded so many persons from the processes that make and carry out social policies? In 1972, by staying in the presidential race all the way to the Democratic National Convention, she hoped to set an example for other non-traditional presidential candidates. She said, the next time a woman runs, or a Black, a Jew, or anyone from a group that the country is not ready to elect to its highest office, I believe he or she will be taken seriously from the start. The door is not open yet, but it is ajar. And through our research, we can determine what might have been and how different the world would have been had, say, Shirley Chisholm taken the White House, or Hillary Clinton. Barack Obama broke ground as the first African-American president, and women continue to strive for equal rights. And thankfully, we have Kamala Harris as our new vice president. So with that being said, I think I've taken all my time. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Roger for questions, but I want to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Kristen and Shawn. I'd ask for the question period if all three of you could stay on. And I know we've had a couple questions come through and that we did want to pose to the group. So let me just get to our question slide here. So I know one of the things, and just to kind of summarize, I think Kristen brought up a lot of great points about what we should be thinking about in terms of training future teachers. And myself having a son who's a 7th grade social studies teacher, white male, that often's a dinner time conversation. When you talk about how do you teach race, right? So for Kristen, what recommendations do you have for those in higher ed that are training and providing tools for our next generation of social studies teachers?
That's actually a great question. So one of the things that we don't really think about is how we pretty much accept the historical narratives that we've been taught as like absolute truth, right? We assume that we've been told the full story. So I would suggest that future social studies teachers get familiar with counter narratives. And Shawn was talking earlier about critical race theory. Counter narratives and counter stories is one of the tenets of critical race theory. But I don't know if you're familiar with this phrase, but they say history is written by the winners, or until the lion can tell its own history, until the lion can tell its own story, history will always be written by the hunter. So one book that I suggest is Ronald Takaki's A Different Mirror. Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is also really popular. I would turn around and show you, but I have to dig and figure out where it is. Diana Berry and Kaylee Goss, I believe, recently came out with A Black Women's History of the United States. So there's all this history that has happened, but students are never taught it because they're taught the same stories year after year. Like my students are always dumbfounded when I tell them about, so we talk about being inclusive of different kinds of groups in our historical narratives. And I was actually preparing earlier a lecture about Bayard Rustin for them. And if you're not familiar, Bayard Rustin is actually the fellow who planned the March on Washington. He was a pivotal civil rights figure, but he wasn't allowed in the forefront because he was gay. So there's someone who was instrumental to this movement happening that we have no idea about, right? Like every student learns about the March on Washington. They learn about the I Have a Dream speech, but nothing about Bayard Rustin. Same for Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer. And I personally have a little grudge because I had to go to graduate school to learn about Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer. So I made it when I was teaching middle school, every kid I taught learned about them. but I make a point of teaching my students inclusive history so that they know that there's way more out there than what they already know.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Kristen. A lot of great suggestions there in terms of readings and things to think about. Shawn, I think it was really interesting. I think the critical pedagogy and things to think about from the librarian perspective. And I know at Gale, we've been in the last couple of months, really from the top down, bottom up, manager training around diversity, inclusion, employee training around that. What would you say are the key questions librarians or higher ed leaders should be asking as they examine their current diversity inclusion initiatives right now?
Great question. There's so many things. I think when you mention employee training, it does bring me to recall the recent executive order that was put in by the current administration that was putting a halt to diversity training that used phrases like critical race theory, and it was focusing on specifically race and sex as terms not to use for that. So I'm going to put that in the chat. But I think that the reason why I mention that is because one of the things that we need to be sure to acknowledge and pay attention to is the relevancy and the urgency for this kind of work, right? And to see it as a really large priority, right? It's not necessarily just the kind of thing that we would do as, maybe once a month service, or something that we would add on to a long list of things that can happen at some point, but instead that these initiatives really should be at the forefront of the 5-year plan, and it should be interwoven into every portion of our work. So whether it's metadata and cataloging, whether it's public services, whether it's even preservation, right? Like, how are we thinking of how these functions of our work can interrelate with reparative justice and can really be shifted in some form, especially when we are at these large institutions with the huge impacts. We're part of the problem, right? As structurally, like, it's no one individually is doing harm if everyone is a part of the solution. But we have to find that solution in our work. So I would have people really brainstorm, gather and brainstorm to say what it could look like in their unit, in their division, in their particular work. Some are more obvious than others. So I think looking to the literature, looking to seeing who is doing this kind of work across the board and getting some feedback on, like there was We Here, which is a organization for librarians of color. They just recently had a talk on cataloging and race, right? And critiquing cataloging from that angle. So, if somebody's focusing on metadata, and they may think, oh, that's not about me, I don't have to worry about that kind of thing. No, actually, it's exactly, you're the one who should be thinking about it and maybe could be a leader in the conversation. And so it's really just being thoughtful about our own contributions, I would say, is one place to begin.
Great, thank you, Shawn. That's great ideas, great suggestions. Well, I know we have a few minutes left. I see we have one other question. Phil, I know you talked a lot about and shared with us some of the things that Gale's doing to support content-wise, diversity initiatives, as well as just for research value, right, with the Shirley Chisholm example. Maybe could you briefly talk about how maybe some part of that publishing process, right? What are some of the things that go into that, looking at archives similar to what you've shared to support, social justice issues and those sorts of things?
Certainly. Well, of course, one of the things that we do is we work heavily with archivists, with librarians, with curators from a number of different institutions around the world to find out what collections are being most studied. But we also focus on issues that are important to society right now, such as social justice, gender and diversity, law and legal issues. So those are some of the things that we do when we are creating the archives. But as editors, we have the fun job of going out and finding this material and I also work on our Archives Unbound program and had the great pleasure to just work with the Amistad Research Center down in Tulane University. There are a number of collections that they have that I am hoping to publish next year that really take a focus on Black lives and the Black experience in the United States. And another issue I'm looking at right now are Latinx cultural issues. So I am trying to find more materials in that regard from a social justice perspective, as well as in the gender and sexuality perspective. So we're always looking for different ways to create new archives that help out with a lot of these 20th century issues, but that really help tell the stories of marginalized people. And unfortunately, a lot of Black history, Latin and Latino history has been marginalized. We're doing our best to make sure that it comes out.
Thanks, Phil. Well, Kristen, Shawn, Phil, thank you very much for your time today. I thought it was great discussion, a lot of things to think about, I think, for the folks that are attending. Just a reminder on the next few days, so I did want to just talk to, for those that are interested, later this afternoon, and there is still time to register. We will be having another session around teaching online and making the most out of that. So that is one later today, as well as tomorrow we have two, one on intersectional teaching, another great topic with primary sources and what are some of those things that you need to be thinking about. And we'll have Professor Danielle DeMuth from Grand Valley State in that session. And then finally tomorrow afternoon, interdisciplinary curriculum and programming. And we'll have Professor Carrie Rasan from University of Connecticut. So we encourage you to please join us for those. And thanks again to our guest speakers today. And everyone stay safe and best wishes. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.